Good morning, everyone. This is Jean Booth with DCFS, Victim Service Grant Management Unit. Most of you already are pretty familiar with me, but today I have Christine Holbert, who's our new GPA, monitoring the chat, and Jenny Escalera, our Program Officer, taking notes on any questions asked. We have a lot to go over today. Your time is important to us, just as it is important that we offer instruction and communication between our agency and yours. Some of this information may be a bit easy for those who've had our awards for years, but we ask that you still actively listen and not multitask during this training, as we hope everyone will be able to learn a few new things. Today, we're going to briefly get to know the Victim Service team, briefly discuss what grants the Victim Service Specialist manage, and discuss risk assessments, and go into detail on how to fill out the RFR workbook and what documentation we need for those submissions. We ask that you type your questions into the chat box. We will address all questions throughout this presentation. And we will have little quizzes and interactive portions, so I would advise keeping the chat box open because we will be utilizing that quite frequently throughout this presentation. Okay, so I wanted to introduce our new Victim Service Manager. She started this week. Her name is Andrea Valenzuela. We're very excited to have her on board. And as you can see, we have quite a few open positions at this time. You guys are pretty familiar with me. I'm the Grants and Projects Analyst, or GPA, for the department. I've been here for 4.5 years. And then we also have Christine Holbert, who's our new Grants and Projects Analyst. She's been here about 4 months. We're super excited to have her on board. And then we have Nita Daisy, who's our Management Analyst, and she processes the RFRs for everyone. She's been here about 2 months, so we're really excited to have her on board as well. Our CAP Program Officer's last day is this Friday, so I'll be assisting with those duties along with Jenny Escalera, who's our Band Coordinator and Crime Victim Liaison, and Dina Fippen, who's our new Crime Victim Liaison. Dina's been here about 3 weeks, and Jenny's been here a little over a year. So we're super excited to have our team, and we hope that you guys get to know all of us throughout the new fiscal year. These are the grants that the Victim Service Specialists manage. So we have the VOCA, Victims of Crime Act Assistance, and then the Victims of Domestic Violence, the Marriage License, or ML Fund, the Family Violence Prevention and Service Act, or FIPSA, and then we've got 3 FIPSA ARPA funding, which is the America Recovery Plan. We've got one specific for domestic violence, sexual victimization, and one for the COVID testing. The programs that we manage are the Victims of Crime Act Compensation, or VOCA Comp, and the Confidential Address Program, or CAP. Now that you've gotten a chance to get to know us a little bit, let's get to know you a little bit. What part of the state do you work in? How long have you worked in victim services? And are you the primary person responsible for completing the RFRs in your agency? If you can go ahead and let us know in the chat, that would be awesome. Your GERS, or your grant instructions and requirements, are updated each state fiscal year and are sent with your executed NOSA. They must be read and the last page signed and returned to our agency. The signature page is now due for the VOCA and Marriage License Awards if you have not already submitted it. Thank you all for participating in the little getting to know you quiz. We're going to now briefly talk about risk assessments and how they affect your RFR submissions. Unfortunately, we're unable to change the name of this tool as it's a requirement for us to have risk assessments on our agency from the feds. The risk level considers numerous factors. It has absolutely nothing to do with our perception of the ability of your organization to perform its goals. It's not something shared with other agencies nor with the public, but it is an internal designation for the DCFS victim service staff. It's not meant to be punitive, rather it's an indication of how much technical assistance to provide, the frequency of fiscal and programmatic reviews, and when your agency will be monitored next. Risk levels may be adjusted throughout the year at the discretion of the GMU depending on the agency's documentation and situation. Agencies may not request risk level changes. You will be notified of your risk level when you receive your executed notice of subaward or your NOSA. Regardless of risk, all agencies must maintain all backup documentation within your agency. Paper or electronic documentation is fine. The GPA reviews are something that can change your risk level. For example, if the GPA finds that the backup documentation for other categories is not accurate with what the agency submitted for on the request for reimbursement, this may change your risk level. Low and moderate risk subrecipients may continue to submit 100% documentation if it's easier for them. If you're low risk, we require that your monthly RFR submission has all your personnel backup documentation, and then the rest of your RFR just needs your general ledger. And we'll request a backup documentation for 100% backup at least once during the fiscal year. Moderate risk is very similar with the low risk, but 100% backup documentation will be requested at least twice during the fiscal year instead of once. High risk, on-site monitoring is required. Monthly or quarterly technical assistance meetings may be required, and your monthly RFR submissions will be 100% backup documentation with all of your RFRs. And just remember, all backup documentation must be maintained internally with your agency regardless of risk level. Here's a summary of the 3 risk levels and what they mean for your agency. It's important to remember that regardless of what risk level your agency falls under, all backup documentation must be maintained internally. Some things you cannot control about your risk level are the last time we completed an on-site review or monitoring on your agency, the total amount of funding you receive from the GMU, and past monitoring findings from our department. There are things that you can do to lower your risk levels, however, and you're doing one right now. Attend all required meetings. Reduce the number of budget modifications. Expend all the funds you are awarded. Submit reports and RFRs on or before the 15th of the month that they are due in. Provide all requests for documentation on or before the date of request. Have qualified, well-trained staff. List your diverse funding sources on your budget summary. Meet your program objectives in your scope of work. While we understand the nature of the population we serve, having scope numbers that state you're going to help 1,000 people when you're only able to help 100 shows us that you don't have an accurate understanding of the population in need. Whereas if you say you're going to help 500 people and you end up serving 450, that's an understandable expectation. Are there any questions on risk level?
Doesn't look like anything, Jean.
Awesome. All right, we're going to do our quiz time. Which agency risk levels are required to maintain 100% documentation of grant expenditures in-house? A, high, B, moderate, C, low, D, all, or E, none? That is correct, everyone. It is D, all risk levels. Even though only high-risk level agencies are required to submit 100% of documentation with all RFRs, all agencies must maintain 100% documentations in their records. True or false? And you can answer T or F in the chat. If an agency is low risk, they will always remain low risk for the rest of the fiscal year. That is correct. It's false. The GMU staff can reassess agency risk levels at any time during the fiscal year. And if we deem that you need a little extra assistance or that we you want us to provide a little bit of extra assistance, we may change the risk level throughout the fiscal year. Just because you start off at one risk level doesn't mean that you're going to stay at that risk level for the entire fiscal year. Are there any questions on that? Okay, we're going to move on to what is an RFR. The RFR stands for the Request for Reimbursement. RFRs are submitted monthly by agencies to get reimbursements for grant allowable expenditures that your agency has made. RFRs consist of a signed RFR cover sheet and backup documentation. Agencies are also required to submit their RFR Excel workbook with each request. All RFR requests are paid on a reimbursement basis only. Proof of payment must exist prior to reimbursement from DCFS Grants Management Unit. All items reimbursed must be during the award period, and they're due no later than the 15th of the month following expenditure. Please remember to check that an item is on your budget prior to submitting for it to be reimbursed. If it's not on your budget, you need to contact a GPA, either myself or Christine, to verify that it is an allowable expense. We're going to run through an overview of the RFR workbook. All RFR requests are paid on a reimbursement basis only. Proof of payment must exist prior to reimbursement from DCFS Grants Management Unit. There will be 3 lines for each employee in your personnel section on your workbook. The personnel section will show a hashtag value in column R, grant allocation percent, until values are entered in columns D through F of that row. This is okay and will not affect your calculations. For the next sections, we'll be using the following sample documentations that were attached to the training invite. You didn't get an example now, so we don't need that for these, but you are going to have your example RFR workbook and example payroll documentation. I would suggest pulling those out to kind of go through this. They will be on the screen, but sometimes it's really difficult to read the tiny print on the screen. So if you have those documentations available, that would be helpful so you can walk through and make notes and work through these exercises. So we're going to navigate the RFR workbook. The RFR workbook has tabs at the bottom. The first tab is the instruction tab. Then there's an RFR and a summary tab for each month. Now let's look closer at the instruction tab. Please review this prior to working on your first RFR. Many of your questions can be answered by reading this page. If you still have questions after reading this page and consulting the grant's instructions and requirements or your GERS, please contact one of the GPAs, myself or Christine. We're here to help you succeed. Now let's talk a bit about the RFR tabs. It's really small on this screen, so please follow along with the example RFR workbook. You can try clicking on most things and you can see that it will not let you because most of this form is locked to prevent editing. You change the values on this sheet by entering information on the summary tab for the month you're requesting RFR for. The top of the sheet will tell you the award number that this RFR workbook is for. This one is 16575-20-XXX. Below that, you will see your agency name. This one is the Victim Services Agency Incorporated. Below this is your agency address. Please make sure this is correct, as if a paper check is ever mailed to you, we want it to send to the correct place. We must use the address that is with the Secretary of State and the Controller's Office. If you need this changed, we can help you with this process. Next, you will see the agency EIN and vendor number. Please check that these are correct. You will also see that this page has information on your approved budget, total prior requests, current requests, year-to-date total, and your budget balance. This should help you check how much of your award has been expended and help keep you on track throughout the fiscal year. When you go to submit your RFR, you will need to do 2 things with this tab. Check if it is an original or revised submission for that month. We'll talk about revised submissions at the end of this training. Print and sign the page to submit with your backup documentation and the workbook. You can sign electronically if your agency allows that. Now that we have reviewed the RFR tab, let's go ahead and discuss the Summary tab, as this is where most of the work in submitting an RFR is involved. The summary rows are locked. They're up in the top part of your summary workbook page. If you need changes to any of this information, like your indirect or some budgetary changes, or if something's not working correctly for formatting, please email either myself or Christine. We're happy to look at that. The summary rows will populate as numbers are entered in the categories below. If for any reason you receive a workbook that's unlocked, please do not change any formulas in this workbook. It screws up the whole thing and causes us to have to reissue your workbook, and it's a real pain in everybody's end. Now we'll move to each section of the Summary tab with an overview of the required backup documentation, and then how to use the backup documentation to fill out the RFR workbook. All personnel, including fringe documentation, is the same regardless of your risk level. Agencies must submit pay stubs and activity-based timesheets or attestations along with the invoice and proof of payment for fringe documentation. The workbooks are set up to allow 3 pay periods per employee per month. If you have additional pay periods or personnel changes, email either myself or Christine the requested changes. This email should have the name and job title of the employee and the effective change date, and we will make those changes and return your updated workbook as quickly as possible. On the personnel section, part 1, which is the first part of this section, you're going to enter in the job title, employee name, grant percentage, and total formulas at the end are going to be locked, so you won't be able to change any of those. You're going to enter in the total hours paid in the total hours worked and the total grant hours from the employee's activity-based time card. The grant percent will automatically populate, that's why it's locked. Enter the gross wage and the check or direct deposit number in the appropriate cells. The grant percentage is the cost allocation for all of your personnel, including your fringe documentation. Documentation for this section of personnel includes the activity-based timesheet and pay stubs. All backup documentation must be submitted in the order it is shown in this section. All costs in the personnel section part 2 are employer paid only. All employee paid fringe is covered in the gross wage from the previous section. You're going to enter the total amount of fringe coverage in the appropriate category. If challenges to the workbook arise, contact your GPA. The personnel total section is locked. Do not edit any formulas on this spreadsheet, and the total column is derived from the employee's total amount of fringe and gross wage. Your grant allocation is derived from the activity-based time cards. This is your cost allocation. The total reimbursement request column is the total amount of the total and the cost allocation. This is the total that you are eligible for reimbursement for each employee. You will notice that we have the following documents in the backup that we provided: pay stubs, activity-based timesheets, proof of payroll tax payment, proof of health insurance invoice, and we unfortunately don't have the proof of health insurance payment. Now, when you submit your documentation, you will provide that proof of health insurance payment so that we know that that was paid for and we can reimburse that. Let's fill out the example RFR workbook together using the example payroll documentation. We'll work through employee 1 together and then give you a chance to practice with employee 2 and employee 3. We're going to start with the first employee, who is Phyllis Gonzalez. Her name is already on the example RFR workbook, so we know that she's either on the approved budget or has been approved to be added to the award by a GPA. If she was not on the workbook, we would need to email a GPA prior to RFR submission with the name of the employee to be added, their job title or job description for the employee, and the month that you want them added to the workbook. When we look at Phyllis's pay stub for the first pay period, we'll need some of this information to complete the workbook. First, we will verify that the pay period was during the award period for this award. The second thing we'll see is that the payroll was paid during the month of July. Other than the first month and the last month of the award, all items must be requested for reimbursement during the month that they were paid, regardless of when that cost was incurred. This means if you paid July payroll in August, you would put that on your August RFR. The next item that we will need is the total hours paid for the pay period. The workbook will say total hours worked, but in most cases, you will need to enter the total hours paid. Some exceptions to this would be if you don't want to bill the grant for a percentage of any PTO or paid time off for employees, or in some situations where workers are paid on a salary basis and not in an hourly basis. If you're not sure about your agency's specific situation, please contact the GPA and we will discuss your specific situation to help you decide the best way to complete the workbook. For this example, we'll assume that the agency wants to be reimbursed for a percentage of the employee's PTO. So you will see the total hours will be 72 hours worked plus 8 holiday hours for a total of 80 hours. The next thing we will need for this workbook from this pay stub is the gross pay for the pay period. The last thing we will need is the check number. Later, we will need to use the employee paid deductions for fringe when working on that section of the workbook, but we'll get to that in a few slides. Now, let's see how that information will get entered into the workbook. Enter the 80 hours paid in the total hours worked column on the first line for Phyllis. Then enter the gross wage of $1,200 from the first pay period pay stub in the first line gross wage column for Phyllis. Then you're going to enter the check number. Finally, we will need to look at Phyllis's activity-based timesheet to get the total grant hours. Once we have that, the grant percent will automatically calculate. What is an activity-based timesheet? It's a special timesheet that breaks an employee time down by funding source. It must reflect the total activities for which the employee was compensated by the agency and cover both federally funded and all other activities. It must be signed by the employee and the employee supervisor who has firsthand knowledge of the work performed. This is an example of an activity-based timesheet. If for whatever reason your agency doesn't have activity-based timesheets, please reach out to the GPA and we can provide you with examples. You do not have to use the GME provided activity-based timesheets. They're just examples so that you have a stepping stone to go off of if you need one. You can see that the funding sources that the agency has received are listed across the top and the dates are listed on the left-hand side. Each day the employee records how much they have worked on activities for each funding source. The form also totals the hours worked each day and the total hours worked for each funding source for that pay period. It also has a spot for the employee's signature and the supervisor's signature. This is just an example, and agencies are welcome to use different formats as long as it contains all the required information. July has the 4th of July holiday, so all the employees at this company were paid 8 hours of holiday pay. This will allow us to show you how PTO is allocated to the correct percentage to an award. Our agency has also created an Excel tool that calculates this for you if you would prefer to use that rather than document on your own calculations. Agencies should include how PTO will be allocated in their policy on grant allocations. In this example, you will see that Phyllis worked 57 hours on VOCA activities. VOCA is the award that we're filling out this workbook on. To get the percentage worked, we're going to divide 57 hours by the total hours worked. Note, this is not divided by the total hours paid or you will be short on hours. When we divide 57 by 72, we get 79.17%. To get the grant hours worked, we will need to multiply the PTO hours, which in this case is 8, by the VOCA time allocation percentage of 79.17%. This gives us 6.3 hours. We will then add the 57 hours to the 6.3 hours to give us a total of 63.3 VOCA grant hours for the RFR workbook. Please note, if we add all the time allocated PTO hours for each funding source, it should equal to the total number of PTO. You will see that 6.3 VOCA plus 1.2 FIPSA plus 0.5 general fund equals 8 hours. It is also useful to add a note, if possible, on how your allocation was completed. Now let's see how that information will get entered into the workbook. Enter the 6.3 or 63.3 hours paid in the total grant hours column on that first line for Phyllis. The number comes from the calculation that we did on the activity-based timesheet. 57 VOCA hours plus the 6.3 PTO allocated to VOCA gives us a total of 63.3 VOCA grant hours for the RFR workbook. And then you can see that the workbook automatically calculated the grant percentage for you. Are there any questions on this so far? I have one that came in that says PTO meaning paid time off as in vacation time. Yes, just for argument's sake, I call any time off PTO. It could be sick time, vacation time, holiday time, or whatever time off that is paid that your agency offers to your employee. That can be allocated to the grants, but you do have to make sure that you use that allocation process. Are there any other questions on this?
Nothing's come through the chat, Jean.
Okay, perfect. All right, so let's move forward and let's see how that information will get entered into. I hit too many buttons, sorry. Oh no, we did that one. Okay, now let's look at how we do the fringe benefits like the health insurance and the taxes. This is a really confusing part for everybody. So when you look at page 13 of your example payroll documentation, you'll see the invoice for the health insurance. Your backup documentation should also show proof of payment for the insurance. An example of this would be like the copy of the check or a bank statement. But for our example purposes, I just wasn't able to create this in time. Please remember to include your proof of payment in your backup documentation. Let's start by looking at employee 1, Phyllis Gonzalez. Her health insurance payment. We can see here that the bill for Phyllis was $415.39. We can't just put this number in the workbook as the employee paid for some of her health insurance. Please also remember to check that the insurance was paid during the month of the RFR you're completing and the covered dates were within that award period. It's small on here, but if you look at Phyllis's pay stubs on pages 1 and 2 of the example payroll documents, we can see that Phyllis paid $10 per pay period for her health insurance. To add the health insurance cost to the workbook, you must remember that only the employer-paid costs can be reimbursed. This means that you need to calculate the portion of the health insurance that was paid by the employer. The easiest way to calculate this is to take the total payment and subtract the employee payment from the check stubs. In this example, you would take $415.29 from the hometown health invoice and subtract the $20 that Phyllis paid, $10 from each pay period, to get $395.30, and you would enter that into the workbook. Remember, you can always make notes on your documentation as it also helps us process this. Since in this example, the health insurance is paid monthly, you will need to divide it by 2 to get the grant allocation correct across the pay periods. $395.39 divided by 2 is $197.70 and $197.69 because of rounding. You will then enter these into the first and second line for Phyllis in her workbook. You would repeat this process for any other fringe benefits you might offer your employee. Now, if you look at pages 14 and 15 of the example payroll documentation, you will see the report on payroll taxes that were paid. You will also want to include proof of payment of the taxes in your backup documentation. When we look at the report, we can see that the date is during our month requesting reimbursement, and that $74.40 was paid for FICA and $17.40 was paid for Medicare for the first pay period. This is what we will enter into the workbook. It's hard to see on here, but the first line for Phyllis, you would enter $17.40 in the Medicare column and $74.40 in the Social Security column, and that would be your FICA. Now let's look at Phyllis's pay stub for the next pay period. First, we'll verify that the pay period was all during the award period for this award. The second thing we will verify is that the payroll was paid during the month of July. If this had been paid in August, we put it on your August RFR. Remember, we reimburse for what was paid. The next item that we will need is the total hours paid for the pay period. You will see the total hours will be 60 hours worked plus 20 vacation hours for a total of 80 hours. The next thing we will need for the workbook from the pay stub is the gross pay for that pay period. The last thing we will need is the check number. Now let's see how that information will get entered into the workbook. We're going to enter the 80 hours paid in the total hours worked column on the second line for Phyllis. Then we're going to enter the gross wage of $1,200 from the second pay period pay stub in the second line gross wage column. And then we're going to enter the check number. Finally, we're going to need to look at Phyllis's activity-based timesheet to get the total grant hours. Once we have that, the grant percentage will automatically calculate. Let's look at Phyllis's second pay period activity-based timesheet. She took some vacation time during this pay period, so we will need to calculate the grant allocation of the PTO just like we did for the holiday on her last pay period. Remember, if you find these calculations too complicated, we have created an Excel tool that calculates this for you. If you want to get reimbursed for PTO, it must be allocated across all funding sources. I'll say that again. Remember, if PTO must be allocated across all funding sources that the employee worked in. You cannot just bill it all to one grant. Agencies should include how PTO will be allocated in their policy on grant allocations. In this example, you will see that Phyllis worked 49 hours on VOCA activities. VOCA is the award that we're filling this workbook out on. To get the percentage worked, we're going to divide 49 hours by the total hours worked. When we divide 49 by 60, we get 81.17%. To get the grant hours worked, we're going to need to multiply the PTO hours, which in this case is 20, by the VOCA time allocation percentage of 81.17%. This gives us 16.2 hours. We will then add the 49 hours to the 16.2 hours to give us a total of 65.2 VOCA grant hours for the RFR workbook. It is also useful to add a note, if possible, on how the allocation was completed. Let's see how that information will get entered into the workbook. We're going to enter the 65.2 hours paid in the total grant hours column on the second line for Phyllis. Remember, this number comes from the calculation that we just did based on the activity-based timesheet. 49 VOCA hours worked plus the 16.2 hours PTO allocated to VOCA gives us a total of 65.2 VOCA grant hours for the RFR workbook. And then you can see that the workbook automatically calculated the grant percent for you. Since in this example, health insurance is billed and paid monthly, it was already calculated and entered for this pay period. It looks like we have a question pop in. Let's go ahead and answer that. Our agency does not provide health insurance. We offer an HRA. Each employee has a specific number of dollars per year. They can use this funding for their monthly healthcare costs or any other medical costs that qualify. I've always put that in operating and not personnel. Should it be tracked in personnel or operating? It should really be tracked in personnel since it is a personnel benefit. We can work with you as a specific agency to kind of go over how that looks with your cost allocation. But since it is a benefit that you're providing for your employees, it should really go into personnel. Are there any other questions that we have on this? I know it's a lot of information.
That looks like the only one, Jean.
Okay, perfect. Well, if you guys have questions, please make sure to ask them in the chat box and we will pause to address them. I want to make sure that you guys are understanding this and it's clear. This is where we're getting most of the issues on the RFR submission. So we really want to make sure that we help you guys understand the personnel section and that reimbursement process for this section. So please ask questions. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about employee taxes. So we're going to look at Phyllis's taxes for pay period 2. And for this pay period, we see that the dates are in the month that we're requesting reimbursement for, and the same amounts were paid for FICA and Medicare as in pay period 1, $74.40 for FICA or Social Security and $17.40 for Medicare. After you enter these, you are done with all the entries for Phyllis, and you will be able to see that the total that is automatically calculated based off the grant allocation to the right of the workbook. Since there was not a third pay period this month, you will see a hashtag value on that third line. This is okay and will not affect your submission. Are there any questions on any of this that we've talked about? Okay. Now let's practice together with Lexi Carr's pay stub. Everybody go ahead and find that chat box because we're going to work together in this. We're going to answer the questions through the chat box. If you don't feel comfortable answering them with everybody involved, you can always send it to either myself or Christine or the organizer, and no one else will see it except for us. What month should this RFR be billed on? That is correct. It should be billed on the July RFR. And how do we know that? Perfect. Yes, it's because of the pay date is in July. And what will the total hours paid be for Lexi? Yes, that's correct. The total hours will be 80 hours paid because there were 72 regular hours plus 8 hours of holiday. What is Lexi's gross pay for this particular pay period? Yes, that's correct. It's $1,220 for this pay period. That is her gross pay. And then the last thing that we need to look at on the pay stub is her check number. What is her check number? That's correct, too. Okay, now let's see how that information is going to get entered into the workbook. What do we enter into the total hours worked column on the first line for Lexi? Yes, that's correct. We're going to enter 80 hours because she had 72 regular and 8 holiday pay. What are we going to enter on the gross wage column for Lexi? That's correct. $1,220 for Lexi's gross wage. And then what are we going to enter into the check number column? Perfect. Yes, we're going to enter 2. So this is what that would look like for Lexi's pace, or for the Lexi's submission on her workbook. Okay, now let's go look at Lexi's activity-based timesheet for the first pay period. She has PTO hours, so we will need to allocate them by funding source. How many hours did Lexi work on the VOCA award? That's correct. She worked 6 hours on VOCA. And how will we calculate the percentage worked hours for VOCA? We're going to divide 6 by the total hours worked, which is 72. And what percentage will that give us? Yeah, that's correct. It's going to give us 8.3%. Because we want to make sure that we're allocating as much as we can to the grant. So we always want to divide the hours worked by the total hours worked on the grant by the total hours worked, not the total hours paid, because you're going to get a less percentage if you do it by the total hours paid, because we haven't allocated the PTO to this just yet. So are there any questions on that, as I know that can be a little confusing? All right, let's move on forward. And how will we calculate how many PTO hours will be allocated to VOCA? We're going to multiply the 8 hours of PTO by the VOCA percent hours worked, which was 8.3%. And how many PTO hours should be allocated to VOCA based off of that math? Right now, we're just looking for the PTO hours. We don't want the total grant hours yet, just the PTO. What is your PTO allocation going to be? Yes, that's perfect. We kind of round to the nearest tenth, so it is that 0.7 hours of PTO allocated to the award. So our total grant hours would be the 6.7 hours, because we do the 6 hours allocated to VOCA, and then the 0.7 hours that was allocated to the PTO time, and that gives us the 6.7 hours. Did we see how we got all of that information? All right, so now we're going to enter the total grant hours, which is the PTO plus the time worked towards VOCA, in the total grant hours column. And then that's going to automatically give us the grant percentage, which is 8% allocated to this grant. Now we're going to move on to health insurance. What additional documentation should you have in your backup that we did not provide for you? Yes, you should include your proof of payment. That's correct. So if this was paid on July 31st, 2022, what month of the RFR should it be billed on? If it was paid in July, what month should you request reimbursement for? Perfect. Yes, that is correct. You would bill it on your July RFR. If the award period is July 1st, 2022 to June 30th, 2023, would this particular invoice be reimbursable for this award? So yes, we've had this question come up a couple times. The question is, what if it was paid in July for August? You're still going to put it on your July RFR, but you're going to end up using the July cost allocation, which are the July hours worked, for that August payment billing. Because it was paid in July, you're going to use the cost allocation for July. I know it's a little bit confusing, but we reimburse on the month that was paid. So you're going to continue keeping that cost allocation and payment in the same month, even if it was for a different month. So for example, this health insurance invoice is due in August and it's for the August insurance. We're paying it in July. So we're going to use all of our July cost allocation, which is our July grant percentage, to base the cost allocation on this payment because it was paid in July. Does that help everybody? Do we still have questions on that? Okay. So yes, you guys are correct that because the award period is July 1st, 2022 to June 30th, 2023, this invoice would be reimbursable for the award because it's for August 22 or 2022, even though we're paying it in July of 2022. And what is the total health insurance payment for LexiCar? So we had a question come in that says, if we choose to pay this invoice on 8/1, then it would go in the August RFR, correct? And that's correct. If you choose to pay this in August, then it would be on your RFR August reimbursement request. And yes, that is correct. You guys are answering the questions while we're answering questions. So this is awesome. The total health insurance payment for LexiCar is $1,019.77. But we have to look at something else before we can enter that amount onto the workbook. What do we need to look at to make sure that we're entering the correct amount onto the workbook? That's correct, the employee payment deducted. So we need to go back and check at Lexi's pay stub to see how much she paid for her health insurance and then deduct that from the $1,019.77. So how much did Lexi pay for her health insurance for this month? Close. So because Lexi was paid twice this month, she paid $220 to her health insurance for the month, or $110 per paycheck. So we're going to have to deduct $220 from Lexi's insurance billing. So from the $1,019.77, we're going to have to deduct $220. Let's see what that looks like. What information will we need to calculate what goes into the workbook? We're going to need the total payment minus the employee payment. And what will that give us? That'll give us the total employer cost. And so that's $1,019.77 minus $220, and that'll equal the $799.77. I think some of you are just a little bit ahead of us on the question. And how will we make sure that this is cost allocated correctly across the two pay periods? Perfect. Yes, we're going to divide that $799.77 by 2. So that'll give us $399.89 and $399.88. Do we have any questions on this cost allocation for this? Okay. So we're going to look at the employee taxes for Lexi. What pay period is this for? Is it pay period 1 or pay period 2? That's correct. It's pay period 1. Should this be billed on the July RFR? That is correct. It was paid in July, so it should be on your July RFR. And what were the FICA taxes for Lexi? That's correct. It was $75.64. And what are the Medicare taxes for Lexi? That's correct. It's $17.69 for this pay period. Workbook will look like with the numbers entered into the correct column. You have your Medicare and your Social Security, or the FICA. Now we're going to speed it up. What information do we need from Lexi's second pay period pay stub? We're going to need a total of 5 things. That's correct. We're going to need the date. We're going to need what date it was paid in, hours worked, PTO dates, gross wage, hours, gross pay. Well, that's fine. Insurance, date, check number. Yeah, we're going to need to know what month it was paid in, their total hours paid, their gross pay, the check number, and the amount of employee paid benefits. Now we're going to look at the employee's timesheet. What are we going to need from her timesheet to enter into the workbook? There's 3 things that we're going to need from her timesheet. So yes, that's correct. We're going to need the VOCA hours worked, the PTO allocated to the VOCA, and then how to figure out that total grant hours. So it's your VOCA hours plus the PTO allocation. That's correct, guys. So for the employee health insurance, is there anything else that we're going to need to do? Because we just did everything on the first pay stub. This is kind of a trick question. The answer's on the screen. It's already completed, so we're not going to have to do anything else. Good job. Okay, so what information are we going to need off of Lexi's taxes? There's going to be 3 things that we want to just double check on this. We always want to check the date paid to make sure it's in that pay period. the FICA, and the Medicare. That's correct. And here's what your workbook would look like with all the items for employee 1 and 2. And I blew up the end part of it so that you guys can see what that looks like. So for Lexi's second pay period, her total with benefits is $1,713.21. And that grant allocation with her PTO allocation is 13%. And the total reimbursement request that she's eligible for is $214.15. Is there any questions on this allocation or how we got to all of this information?
Nothing coming in, Jean.
All right.
Still quiet.
Okay. So we've provided you with a third employee for you to practice on your own with, and we've supplied what the completed workbook should look like so you can check your work and see if you're understanding this without being instructed for it. So if you have questions on these after you guys start working on this, please go ahead and reach out to us. We're always willing to help you kind of walk through this if you would like us to. And there was a question that came in that says, do any of the grants pay for overtime? So if that is a benefit that your agency offers to all funded staff, grant or otherwise, then yes, we would need to have that policy stating that that is a benefit that your company offers. And then you would need to cost allocate that overtime across funding sources that it's eligible for. Are there any other questions on this? Okay. So this is what the completed payroll section will look like with all three of those employees. If you complete all the payroll section, you should get a total reimbursement for that section. You can see this to the right side of the workbook in the personnel section, or at the top of the workbook in the summary section for that month. I've provided copies of both sections for your review. Okay, we're going to move on to travel and training section. If you guys still have questions on personnel, feel free to ask them in the chat box. If you have any questions throughout the rest of this training, please feel free to ask them in the chat box. We will continue to answer all questions asked. All travel training must be pre-approved and on your budget narrative. It must be related to the purpose of the grant, and we can only reimburse after the trip or the training has been completed. Please be sure to review GERS 2315 on allowability of specific costs and GER 2317 on travel. We can only reimburse after the trip or the training has been completed. If for whatever reason you have a travel or training that comes up after your NOSA has been executed, please reach out to your GPA, either myself or Christine, to get pre-approval on any trainings that you want to allocate to this award. All training must be pre-approved, so we have to make sure that it's an allowable training to go on to the award and be paid for the award. I would really hate for you guys to go do a training and then find out that it wasn't an allowable expense or an allowable training for that particular funding source. Okay. Reimbursements for incidentals will only occur when the travel consists of a flight and/or overnight stay. For meals, we want to show all meal and food purchase if it was for an employee who is traveling or for a victim. Meals for employees should be in the travel or training section, and meals for victims should be in the other section. Meals for employees are only reimbursable when the employee is in travel status and when the final destination is more than 50 miles one way from the employee's workstation. To document this and the purpose of the travel, meals or refreshments served during meetings to employees, boards of directors, professional associations, or members of the public are not allowed. Meals will be reimbursed at the GSA rate For the employee's destination, a printout of the GSA rate for the area visited must be attached to the RFR. Actual cost versus GSA rate depends on the agency's written travel policies. If you're reimbursing actual cost, your agency must include meal receipts. We cannot submit both reimbursement methods. Only one method will be accepted and must apply to all travel reimbursements for that agency. And remember, we can never reimburse tips on meals. And if your agency is going to reimburse actual cost over the GSA rate, please remember that the GMU cannot reimburse anything over the GSA rate. So if you're doing meals that are over that GSA rate, we can only reimburse up to that rate. And we'll talk about the GSA rates in just a few slides. Travel to a destination that is at least 50 miles one way from your workstation can be reimbursed. You have to depart at or before 7 a.m. for breakfast, depart at or before 11 a.m. and return to your worksite after 1:30 p.m. for lunch, or depart at or before 5:30 p.m. and return to work after 7 p.m. for dinner. Meals provided as part of the meeting or conference agenda are not eligible for reimbursement. And so the U.S. General Service Administration, or the GSA rate, can be found at this website on your screen. These change effective with the fiscal year each October 1, and they can also change. I know the mileage rate changes usually in January of every year. Occasionally, the mileage rate will change throughout the fiscal year. For example, this year in July, they changed the mileage rate because of how expensive the gas has become. So please remember before you submit your travel reimbursement to check this GSA rate and add this printout to your request for reimbursement so that we know what GSA rate you're requesting reimbursement for. Your travel documentation requires a printout of your GSA rate for your location, the receipts for parking, any receipts for airfare, any receipts for car rental or other ground transportations. Remember, we do not reimburse for tips or donations. A hotel front desk itemized receipt, your proof of payment, a mileage log and proof of payment to employee for mileage reimbursed. Please remember that travel to and from employees' residence and work is not allowed, but if your employee is taking their personal vehicle to assist a victim to go to a counseling session, that is allowable, and you need to make sure to have that log and proof of payment for that. And then any conference or training agenda. All travel training must be pre-approved and on your budget narrative or pre-approved by the grants management team in an email. All expenses related to a single trip must be submitted on the same RFR month in order to avoid duplication of payment on different elements of the same trip. Are there any questions on travel or training? Okay, we're going to move on to operating. Backup documentation for each section must include invoice, cost allocation, and proof of payment. If payment is made with a credit card, the credit card statement listing the purchase must be submitted as well as proof of payment to the credit card company for the statement amount. You're going to enter a brief description of expense on the workbook. For example, rent. And then you're going to enter the payee or the vendor. Then you're going to enter the total amount of that expense from the invoice, along with the check number you paid the expense from and the date it was paid. Then you're going to enter the allocation percent to each funding stream. We offer 4 different funding stream allocations on the workbook. If you have other allocation, or if you have more than 4 funding sources allocated to the expense, put the allocated amount for the grant in the yellow highlighted section and provide allocation on each invoice. All allocations must equal 100%. And if not already listed, please type in the funding stream that you're allocating the invoice to. Backup documentation for each section must include invoice, cost allocation, and proof of payment. All right, let's talk about equipment. This is one of the more confusing sections of your workbook. Equipment must be pre-approved and on your budget narrative. This includes electronics of all types, such as computers or cell phones. Equipment should be labeled with property of grant name and number. You're going to want to reference your GER 2322, and that explains what must be kept on the equipment log with your purchase. It's also the information that's listed on this screen right now. So you want to have your equipment log, make sure that it has all of this information on it, and those equipment logs will be reviewed at time of monitoring. Computers should be labeled with property of grant name and number, and for detailed information, please remember to reference GERS 2322 or reach out to your GPA. And please remember that equipment includes computers of all kinds, which also does include cell phones, as most smartphones are considered computers. All right, we had a question come in. If the item is paid with credit card, the receipt recording the purchase would not be enough. It also needs a credit card statement. Did I understand correctly? Yeah, because the credit card statements show that you paid for that. So the receipt, this has been one of the frustrations we've been having internally. The receipt, while yes, it does show that you paid for it on that, we really want to make sure that you have a paper trail showing that you actually paid for that with a company card of some sort. And then, so we need to have proof of payment from some sort of either your company credit card or the company check or something related to your agency. So if like I were to turn in a receipt that said, you know, I bought a cell phone for my staff, but all I did was show you the receipt. You can't tell from the receipt if I paid that with my own card or if I paid that with the company card. And we want to make sure that we're not using our own personal funds to get reimbursed by the grants. So we have to have that proof of payment, which is that credit card statement and the proof of payment to the credit card. And then we had another question says, if we wrote a phone system into our grant budget, we still need pre-approval when we go to actually purchase, correct? Sort of. So if you wrote the phone system into your grant budget, if it's a software system, then we would require that you try to at least get 3 quotes to get the most affordable phone system. Generally speaking, in areas there's limited service providers, especially out in the rurals. So I can understand if you can't get the 3 quotes, but if you have the phone system and it's a landline phone system, like I know out in Reno, it's mostly just Charter. So you would get that phone system, but provide the GMU with the documentation of that system. When we're talking about the computers and the cell phones, it's the actual phone itself. The software wouldn't be part of that equipment purchase because it's not a tangible thing. It's the phone or the computer itself, and then all the software or the like phone system, like your phone bill, all of that would be in your operating section. Does that help? Okay, perfect. I'm glad it makes sense. Okay, if there's any other questions, please go ahead and plop them into the chat box, and we will move on to your contracts and consultants section. Prior to your initial reimbursement, your consultant or contracts must be on your budget narrative and approved by the GMU. Your contract, any applicable licenses, and the confidentiality forms must be submitted to the GPA, myself or Christine, prior to your first RFR submission. Documentation needed for your RFRs is an invoice from the contractor or consultant, the cost allocation, and proof of payment. One of the changes for this year is your contracted payment will not be reimbursed until the GMU verifies that a current copy of your contract has been received by your agency. So please remember, if you have contracts or consultants on your budget, that you've provided the contract, the license, and confidentiality form to us prior to your first reimbursement request. Otherwise, that contractor will not be reimbursed. Are there any questions on contract? Okay, we're going to briefly go over match. Most of my VOCA subrecipients have match waivers, so this doesn't really apply to any of you who have match waivers. If you do have FIPSA funding or did not request a match waiver for your VOCA funding, you will need to pay attention to the match section. This match section requires documentation based on the category. So personnel documentation is the same as in personnel, and any non-personnel would be the same as a non-personnel. So documentation is the same for each category as if you were requesting reimbursement. Your volunteers as match documentation, you need a volunteer sign-in sheet and a volunteer evaluation printout. If you need examples on the volunteer evaluation, please reach out to the GPA and we can help you figure that out. Your match should be identified on your general ledger. And for more information, see GERS 2311, cost sharing or match requirements. Match is filled out exactly as previous sections. Documentation is required as in previous section. All documentation must be provided in the order it is laid out on the match tab and must be for the month that you are seeking reimbursement for. Match is required for VOCA and FIPSA awards unless you have a match waiver for VOCA. Unfortunately, FIPSA does not allow match waivers. Match can be volunteers, in-kind support, or any services not paid for by federal funding. For further information regarding match, please reach out to myself or Christine or review GER 2311. Right, we're going to talk about indirect briefly. If you have indirect on your award, the RFR workbook will automatically calculate it based on the other category information that you submit. As you can see in the example, our personnel category had roughly 5,200 in RFR submission, and our indirect calculated that at the 10% de minimis of 528. So we will have indirect training at some point during this fiscal year. And so if you have questions on indirect, please know that we are going to provide training on that. Now we're going to talk about submitting your RFR. We're going to make sure that all the items are on your approved budget or that you have an email with GPA approval for items not on your approved budget. Double check what you entered in the workbook matches your documentation. Write notes on any documentation that you think might need further explanation. Print and sign the RFR tab for the month you are submitting. You can also sign this electronically. Put the documentation you are requiring to submit, see your risk level, in the order that they are listed on your workbook summary tab and scan them as a PDF. Email the RFR workbook, the signed RFR cover sheet, and all backup documentation to fundsrequest@dcfs.nv.gov. We had a question come in. If a staff volunteer on off hours can count that as part of match. So I think I just muted myself, I apologize. So I think what the question is asking is if your staff volunteers on off hours, can that be counted as part of match? Yes, it can. We kind of don't want to encourage staff to volunteer time because if they're already employed by you, they really should get getting paid for the hours that they work for you. If they want to volunteer, that's completely up to them, but they're not required to volunteer when they work with grant funding. I hope that helps. Are there any other questions on anything we've gone over? Okay, let's talk about revised RFRs. If you want to add additional costs, remove costs, or change any costs to an RFR workbook that you've previously submitted, you're going to do a revised RFR. You're going to check the revised box on the RFR tab for that month, print and sign the RFR cover sheet, and email all the information to the funds request email with an email explaining the changes that you have made, an attachment with the signed RFR cover sheet, and any additional backup documentation for the new items added. So we do not want to resubmit all previous documentation, just the documentation for the changes. And then please make sure that you always send your Excel workbook with your RFR submissions, whether they're originals or revisions. So this is what your RFR cover sheet is going to look, and that's the box you're going to click if it's a revision. So let's talk about the award period. Services prior to the first day of the award cannot be charged, and some expenses may need to be prorated. For example, VOCA and marriage license start July 1st, 2022, and go through the end of the fiscal year. So services prior to July 1st, 2022 cannot be charged to these awards. So you may have to prorate some of those expenses. And the same goes for the end of the fiscal year. The grant cannot reimburse for services after the last day of the award period. This may also require proration. If you're not sure how to do this, please reach out to the GMU and we can help you with proration. RFR processing. If your employee or an item is not on the workbook and/or your budget narrative, it will not be reimbursed. Please pay attention. Like, you must contact the GPA, either myself or Christine, prior to submitting your RFR workbook with an employee or item that is not on the workbook or budget narrative. So if you have employee changes, you need to reach out to either myself or Christine prior to that RFR submission so that you can get reimbursed for that employee. If that employee is not on your workbook and you've supplied backup documentation, we are not going to reimburse that employee because they are not on the workbook and they were not approved by our department. You have to contact us prior to that RFR submission. All documentation must be maintained by your agency for all RFR requests. Our goal is to process all RFRs within 30 days after the receipt of the request. And taking a few extra minutes when preparing your RFR and following these instructions will greatly increase our ability to meet this goal. RFRs are submitted on a reimbursement basis only. They are due no later than the 15th of the month following expenditures. All documentation must be maintained by your agency for all RFR requests. If an employee or item is not on the workbook and/or the budget narrative, it will not be reimbursed. The management analyst may request clarification or additional documentation if needed. If a response from your agency is not received within 5 days, we will process that RFR minus the items in question, and you will have to submit a revision if you wish to have those costs reimbursed. Any requests for workbook changes must be emailed with the workbook to either myself or Christine before submitting your RFR. If approved, the workbook will be updated and returned to your agency as quickly as possible. Generally, we return those workbooks the same day, if not sooner. Our goal is to process all RFRs within 30 days after receipt of the request. Following these instructions will greatly increase our ability to meet this goal. We're going to be a bit stricter about items being on the approved budget this year. Please email the GPA if a cost arises that is not on your budget for approval prior to putting it on your RFR. You may end up needing a subaward amendment depending on the item. At this time, we'll answer any other questions that come up, and just want to remind everyone that all RFR submissions are to be sent to the funds request email with your workbook and all required backup based off of your risk assessment. For a greater chance of receiving answers, email requests should be made to the GPA, either myself or Christine, and the DCFS grants email. That way, if someone is out sick or on vacation, we all have access to your email. Thank you so much for your time. At this time, we'll address any questions that came through in the chat box. If you still have questions, please ask them now. We'll stay on for another few minutes to answer any questions. But thank you guys so much for your time. We'll give you the last 40 minutes back of your day.